I'm very happy to be here. I'm delighted to see so many people in the auditorium. I didn't think we were... I'm glad the subject is that popular. Now, you may have noticed in Valerie's introduction, she said the research project ran from 2008 to 2012. Well, as you can see, things always take a little longer. So we're still at it, I'm afraid. Okay, well, what we're talking about is an Elizabethan merchant vessel which sank actually in the Thames estuary, rather than in London itself, way out between Southend and Margate. But it was, we feel sure, heading outbound from the Port of London, which is why we see it as a London ship. The project, like all projects, has many partners and many collaborators. I should have put all the logos on, but people keep changing their logos, so I thought I'd just put the names on instead. You can see the main funder was actually the Port of London Authority, whose channel clearance campaign led to the initial discovery of the merchant ship. Gresham College themselves have also supported us, as have the Mercers Company, which was once, of which Thomas Gresham was once a member. The research work was done jointly between University College London and the University of Southern Denmark, with able support from the Nautical Archaeology Society, who are a diving fraternity who've helped us greatly, English Heritage, who you may have heard of, and their research institution way down in Fort Cumberland, the Royal Armouries, who looked at the guns and things, the Museum of London, who you may recognise, and also Southend Museum Services and the receiver of REC, Alison Kentuck, down in Southampton. So it's not just moi, but a whole bunch of people have contributed to this remarkable project. The first thing I should say is if you think of 16th century ships, you tend to think of this little chap. Has anyone not recognised that one? Hands up anyone who doesn't recognise the Anthony Roll image. Brilliant. And how many have actually seen this chunk of medieval woodwork? That's quite a few. Yes, it's the Mary Rose, of course. And when you think of 16th century nautical archaeology, the mind is focused on a remarkably atypical 16th century ship. It's a custom-built warship which was being redesigned throughout its life and was not by any means the typical exemplar of 16th century vessels. It's 700 tons, huge length, much larger than the average merchantman, much taller than the average merchantman, and much heavier with a much larger crew than the average merchantman. So if you want to study 16th century nautical archaeology and the role the merchant vessel played in the 16th century and the discovery of the world, etc., it's not so much looking at the warships as the merchant ships. The merchant ships are the typical items of the day. It's like looking at a yeoman's cottage and a castle. You can learn far more about the society if you look at the merchant ships of the day, which is what we're trying to do. So the Mary Rose looks at warships splendidly, but we're looking at the 16th century armed merchantman. Now the story begins, for us at least, in about 1846, when there was a pioneering underwater archaeological excavation in the Thames estuary. 1846, that's a long time ago. This was hard hat divers, with those big helmets shoved on their heads and air being piped down from the surface to these guys working on the seabed. This diving technology was developed by the Dean's brothers, who lived at Whitstable, and one of the first sites they worked on was actually the Mary Rose, way back in the 1840s in the Solent. And they were able to recover guns and all sorts of things from the Mary Rose in Portsmouth, and people were very impressed with this underwater technology. one chap who was impressed was the Duke of Wellington, who was the warden of the Cinque Ports, and he realised that if you could salvage all these wrecks, you could sell all the stuff and make a lot of money. So in a very commercial way, underwater archaeology began as salvage work, and the Dean's brothers and their associates were put to work by the Duke of Wellington to salvage stuff from this wreck. And what we're looking at is something like 2,700 lead ingots, which even today would cost you quite a lot. So they're worth salvaging. And also some iron, some lead, and a number of guns were found, all of which were taken away, melted down, and went into the coffers. But it wasn't entirely brutal salvage work by people in hard hats diving down to the bottom of the estuary. Some antiquarians got involved, and they presented an ingot stamped with a royal crest, a knife with a fleur-de-lis, an ancient leather shoe, and a silk doublet of 16th century type at the British Archaeological Association meeting, so amongst fellow antiquarians. So clearly it wasn't just an ancient wreck, but was a 16th century wreck. But unfortunately, apart from the 2 paragraphs in the Journal for British Archaeology, people then forgot about it. They forgot where the location was, having removed everything they could get from the seabed, and people forgot where the site actually was. But not forever. I'm sure you all know that in November 2013, DP World opened the massive London Gateway Port, which is a huge container terminal in the Thames estuary. The Port of London used to be right the way around there. It's now drifted out to sea past Tilbury and has now got to DP World, or can be. So as the port drifts eastward, it's absolutely huge port, and it deals with massive containers which are brought in by the largest ships of the day. Here you can see it's on a huge belt of reclaimed land in the Thames estuary. Now these ships are very large indeed, the largest ships in the world, and they're stacked with containers. And to get these vessels up to the estuary, you have to dig out the navigation channels. So to accommodate these huge ships, this is or was the largest ship in the world, you have to dredge the estuary. And it was during the dredging of the estuary that the Port of London Authority did actually put in an archaeological evaluation, survey and investigation. In other words, as the dredge was continuing through the navigation channels, so sites of wrecks were perhaps flagged up in advance or found during the dredging work. And a number of wrecks were found, which have been published by Wessex Archaeology in London Gateway, Maritime Archaeology and Thames Estuary. And amongst the many periods of wrecks discovered was a 16th century wreck, the Tudor, the Gresham Ship in the Prince's Channel. So the first part of the tale begins in 2003-2004 with Jens Auer working then for Wessex Archaeology, now in the University of Southern Denmark, diving in the Prince's Channel, the dredged channel, which is practically the open sea, in zilch visibility, where the wreck remains were recovered by the dredgers and brought to Denton Wharf at Gravesend, where some terrestrial recording could take place. Now, this shows you where the site actually was. The top map is a landlubber's map with all the detail on the land, and the sea is just that sort of white stuff over there. And you can see the site is sort of, if you draw a line between Southend and Margate, it's sort of roughly midway between the two. The bottom map is not a map, but a chart, and is drawn by sea lubbers, if you like, where the land is all the white stuff, and the sea is not just the sea, but also all the shoals and sandbanks which fill the estuary. And you can see the problem. If you draw a line from Margate to Southend, and you look roughly in the middle, these are roughly to the same scale, you'll see the Gresham Ship site, but you'll also see the sand flats and the shoals which fill the estuary. You can see it would be very hard to bring a large container ship through that lot. They have to go through a dredged channel, which you can't see on the landlubbers map. So that's where it was, and I've just put these two little images there. I wonder if you can tell me why. This is the standard image of underwater archaeology in action, with happy divers swimming on top of the Gresham Ship with its large anchor. Why do you think I put that one on? Visibility in the Thames estuary is very, very difficult. And the excavation actually took place by the technology of hands fiddling about on the seabed, trying to locate the stuff and then fixing points that could be then GPS and things. So a very, very difficult excavation in advance of dredging work. Large slabs of the vessel were found, and those who were alive in 1982 and saw the Mary Rose being gently raised from the Solent, this is the hook ness, a slightly more robust way of raising bits of old ship, without any large cradles, just a few slings, and they got 5 or 6 pieces up. And they were gently placed on the deck of the hook ness, and then it sailed off to Denton Wharf at Gravesend. These are quite large chunks, as you can see here. This is a human scale, and this is a section of 16th century ship. You can see this is the bit that was sticking up on the seabed, all battered and eroded, and that's the bit that was in the sands and silts. This is a view of part of the underside of the vessel, with all the barnacles and biodiversity growing on it, and putting a number of planning points on there, which could then be lasered in. And this is the ship, the hook ness, the dredger having collected its fragments of ship, being taken back to Gravesend, and then, this is at Gravesend, and then on more or less dry land, it was possible to record these where the visibility is a lot better. And this is Wessex archaeology recording the ship timbers shortly after they've been raised. And then they were picked up again, and because they couldn't be left at Denton Wharf in Gravesend, and they went down to Portsmouth, where the Nautical Archaeology Society lived, where they were put in temporary storage. But again, this is part of the bow assembly, and again, you can just see it in relation to, these are human beings, and that's a 16th century shipwrightery. So it was possible to, you would never do this underwater, it was possible to do a general record of the timbers, and in fresh air, you can actually see, these straits. This is part of the port side, which had collapsed outwards. You can see that this part of the timber, of the hull side, has got an additional little piece in here, which is, this is where the deck level would be, and a little piece in there which demonstrates it's a gun port. It's actually a hole deliberately set into the timber work. So it's an armed merchantman. It's got integral gun ports, holes for guns, built into it as part of the initial design. Doesn't make it a warship, but it does mean it was armed. And we found a couple of those. So here you see the elements that as they would have appeared on the seabed, had the visibility been sufficient to see it. This you can see as the sharp end. This is the bow of the vessel. This is the floor of the vessel, if you like, and this is part of one side of it. So if you want to see the whole vessel, you mirror image this and put that on that side, and you can see how large the vessel was. There's a scale there. You see all these blocks are about 5 meters long. Now, what we've done here is we've just turned it on its side. That's the bow, and this is the bow fragment. And there you see that photograph you saw before of the bow fragment. That is that, and there's the human scales. So you can see how big this is. And there's part of the side of the fragment, with the human scales there. So this is quite a big ship, in other words. This is not a boat. This is definitely a ship, of which we only have a part of one half of it. That's the sharp end. We don't have the stern assembly or the rudder. That was never found. It wasn't there. And we've lost the entire starboard side. So if that's all we've got, you can see it was a big vessel, but it's enough to work out what it was. What date was it? Well, amazingly, from 12 timber samples way back in 2004, we managed to get a bark edge date of 1574, felling date. You see here some samples of timber with the bark and sapwood in, so that's when they stopped growing at that point. And we were able to, or rather Nigel Nailing at the University of Lancaster was able to come up with a date of 1574 for the felling of the timbers. Therefore, the boat must be built 1574, 1575, something like that. Another means of dating it came from one of the 4 guns found, and give us the sort of the nomenclature for the vessel, which we like to call the Gresham Ship, because that's Thomas Gresham. He was an amazing Elizabethan financier and a scholar and a merchant and a gun founder. So the ultimate Renaissance man. And one of the guns, as you can see over here, actually had his initials, TG, on it, and his grasshopper motif. Now that, you'll have to believe me, that is a grasshopper. Honest, guys. It's his little head, and there's his big legs. And this, you may be more inclined to believe, is a TG for Thomas Gresham. So this is from his Mayfield gun foundry, and therefore also gives us a late 16th century date for the vessel. So both the guns and the dendrochronology demonstrate it's a late 16th century vessel. So by 2004, there was a shipwreck, substantial fragments of which have been recovered from the estuary, and various parts, tiny fragments of its cargo had been discovered, recovered, and put into store. So by 2007, 2008, we decided to try and look at this material, and the Port of London Authority decided to help fund the research programme. So we thought the Hull Studies programme would be conducted by Jens Auer, the original dive supervisor on the wreck, with his new position as assistant professor at the University of Southern Denmark. So the Hull Studies programme took place in Denmark. The Fine Studies and Conservation programme took place at University College London, as indeed so did the outreach programme. And then last year, and still continuing this year, we are undertaking the publication of all those various things. So briefly, to start with the Hull Studies programme, the temporary store for the timbers was this lake at Horsey in Hampshire, near Portsmouth. Now, I'm not allowed to tell you this, so you must promise to forget everything I say for the next 2 minutes, or I'll have to shoot you. This is a Ministry of Defence torpedo testing lake. And I don't know how they test the torpedoes. It's a long, thin strip of water. Presumably, you launch a torpedo, and if it gets to the other end in a straight line, you keep that one. If it veers off into the landing bay here, then perhaps you send that back to the manufacturer. I don't know. Anyway, this is a torpedo testing lake, which was deemed, because it wasn't being used, was the Ministry of Defence kindly allowed the Nautical Archaeology Society to store all the timbers there. Now, it's a very shallow lake, and therefore recording could continue. The timbers weren't decaying, weren't drying out. It was possible to continue the recording of them in shallow water with much better visibility and no tankers going overhead. This haven of peace was interrupted several years later when they decided to start testing underwater explosives in there, which are not awfully good for 16th century timbers, but I didn't tell you that. That's another reason that you must forget everything I said. Maybe you'll do it naturally, who knows. So the study of the timbers has been quite profitable. We've been able to decide the type of vessel it was. It was an armed merchantman, and we know its date, and it's our colleagues at University of Southern Denmark. It's clearly late 16th century. It was carvel built with planks on edge, very robustly framed, which is why we know it's a merchantman, with integral gun ports, to carry a large, bulky cargo, integral gun ports armed for belligerence if required. It must have been in the region of at least 160 tons. It was about that length, with a width of about quite fat, actually, a width of about 7.5 metres or so, and a relatively deep hold of about 3.4 metres. Not dissimilar, actually, to the Golden Hind, the replica of the Golden Hind, which is berthed next to Southwark Cathedral. So if you want a general image of the approximate size and type of the Gresham Ship, go and have a look at the replica on the River Thames of the Golden Hind. It's a slightly different length and slightly narrower in width, but broadly speaking, it's a similar beast. So it is one of the few merchantmen that we've actually got to look at, as opposed to these military vessels. Now, even though it's a merchantman, it had at least 4 guns, and given the ones that the Duke of Wellington found, it may have had something like 12 guns, so modestly armed. And these guns are with the Royal Armouries at Fort Nelson in Hampshire, where they're put into these tanks which desalinate them. They wash the salt out and replace them with fresh water, which is quite a long process. And we're very grateful to have Phil McGrath doing that work for us. 4 vessels were recovered by feeling around in the Thames estuary. One was a very old type of vessel for the late 16th century, a wrought iron breech loader, which you see there with these hoops on it. We had a cast iron muzzle loader and 2 cast iron guns, of which the Gresham gun with the TG and the grasshopper, honestly it's a grasshopper, bring it up to 4. Now you don't have to be a gun expert to realise all these guns are different sizes, different lengths, different bores, so all would fire differently and would need different sorts of shot. So it's and all are different dates. So a bit of a hodgepodge of armaments on this vessel, not what you might expect on a top-of-the-range military naval vessel, where you'd expect to have everything far more standardised. So you can see that these medieval armed merchantmen would just get guns when they needed them, pop down to B&Q and buy one, get one free sort of stuff. So there's not a lot of planning gone into their guns. They're expensive, so you get them when you need them. This could be 50 years older than some of these. So the ordnance itself is interesting, and the finds also took quite a lot of work. The finds initially took place at Fort Cumberland, which is also down near Portsmouth. And again, there's the problems of desalination, but the main problem was the fact that a lot of these finds, we didn't know what they were. They came up as concretions, and sands and gravels had accumulated round them in a huge tortoise-like shell. Some of the finds were okay. We did find some leather. This is part of a leather boot, seaman's boot, presumably kicked off. Boots are very fine when it's raining, but if you're drowning, it's the last thing you want, so presumably kicked off as the seaman was struggling to get to the surface. The occasional spoon. These are relatively straightforward artefacts, of which the method of conservation and research is fairly well known. But this is what UCL students the graduate students had to deal with. What is that? it's a concretion where all the sands and gravels have sort of glued onto it and obscured what it was. So everything has to be X-rayed. You can see there's a little something up there. And then the conservation procedure is to remove all this compacted, it's called concretion, that gives you a clue. All this concretion has to be knocked off. Now this is a relatively modest little thing, which you keep knocking bits off, and you end up with a little salt cellar thing. So this is straight from the captain's table, a little salt holder to go with his Sunday lunch. So, even these ships, these rough, robust merchantmen, the captain kept a nice table. But, so the whole conservation procedure, you're always taught to believe it's done by people in nice white coats in labs with little toothpicks dabbling away at the dirt of ages. But with these marine things, you get very large slabs of goodness knows what, and you take a large hammer and you keep bashing it. So it's a completely different conservation procedure. What's that then? Is that worth keeping? Would you have kept that? Well, you bash it for a bit and it ends up looking like that. Would you have kept that? You bash it for a bit more. That's what it did look like. And gradually it ends up being a very large powder chamber for an iron gun with two nice handles on the side. You never know what you're going to find. So it's quite interesting. And the tools you need are a large hammer, a club hammer. That's conservation in 2008. And this is this is me finding this doesn't work. Oh, how amazing. What did I do? Was it moi? Anyway, today I'm going to tell you about the Gresham Ship project, which started... Oh, yes, I'll do it that way. Good man. Keep going, yes. That'll do, somewhere around about there. Round of applause for the man who can do these things.
So, is this later?
Yes, that's it. Thank you. Well done. Is it working now?
It is, yeah.
It's okay. Thank you. I'm okay with hammers. I'm not too good at technology. So that was just finding the objects was difficult. And once you found them, and then we do metallurgical analysis, isotopic analysis on them. And this is Professor Marcos Martinón Torres, who worked not just on the pewter and objects, but also on the cargo of the vessel. We did find elements of the cargo, which were ingots of lead and tin. Here you see one of these boat-shaped ingots, amazingly heavy, and some of them had little stamps on. I don't know if you can see them, but can you see it's got thousands of stamps all over it, stamped on. And here is one of the stamps with some Thames Estuary biodiversity wriggling around. We've never been able to identify the stamps, but clearly somebody wanted to. It's a British lead, but we don't know whose lead it was, other than that it is, its isotopic signature says it is British. So if you can imagine the guys feeling around in the Thames Estuary, sometimes they find a lead ingot, swim around a bit more. Sometimes they found a bit of ballast, a ragstone lump, and then they find these things, which when you get up to the surface, you realise are tin ingots. There's these strip ingots, which are actually tin. So this is part of the cargo, the tin ingots. These are the lead ingots, and this is the ballast, Kentish ragstone ballast in the bottom of the vessel. So how do you distinguish those underwater? You can't. You have to bring everything up and then sort it out in the bright daylight of Fort Cumberland in Hampshire. So we have British tin and British lead, but we also have these amazing bar iron. Now, these are square section like railway lines, but they're bent over, sometimes twice and sometimes 4 times to make them more easy to carry. Now, this idea of folding bar iron is in the 17th and 18th century in particular is called voyager iron or slave iron, because it can be carried easily by a pack horse once you've folded it up. When you stretch it out, it's 6 meters long, but when you fold it up, it's only about 1.2 meters long. And it was used for the sold off in Africa in exchange for slaves, amongst other things. And the study of these iron bars, the magnesium content of them suggests they're not British iron, but come from the Rhineland area, Liège, Belgium, or something like that. So why is London exporting iron? It's certainly not importing iron because we've got plenty, but this does look like a cargo which has been deliberately amassed in London, deliberately for re-export. So that's a very quick run through the research on the ship and the artefacts, and we're now trying to get the volumes published. Volume 1 is now in the press, and that's looking at the hull and the ship itself. Volume 2, the artefacts and the context of the vessel, will be out by the end of this year. Part of the context of the vessel is that it is, we can, I think, confidently state it was sailing out from London. So it has something of the Port of London in it, and it's as well worth remembering that this view of the Port of London, this Brown-Hergenberg view of London in its late Elizabethan prime, is exactly contemporary with the Gresham Ship. The 16th century port of London had been subject to major reorganisation in the way that customs were collected from the very early years of Elizabeth's reign, with the construction of the new Elizabethan custom house in London, and all cargoes had to be offloaded in what were called the legal quays between the Tower and London Bridge. And the important point about this new revenue collection technique was that port books were drawn up by the customs officials who listed the name of the ship, the captain of the ship, where the ship came from and where the ship was going to, and itemised the cargo, because virtually everything that was being imported or exported had a value, had a tax value for it. So because of the reform of the port in the 1550s, that such port books as survive, unfortunately not enough of them, we are able to have a really interesting window on the types of cargoes and the milieu in which the Gresham Ship functioned. There is the late 16th century custom house where the port books were written up. This is also a very important period in that, as Valerie mentioned, this is the period at which the Royal Exchange was established, where merchants could come together and trade currency, ideas, cargoes in this building, this red brick building, just like the custom house, and also sell exotic products in the shops, which were around the outside and inside of the quadrangle. So this was hugely important in bringing together the very cosmopolitan merchant community and enabling deals to be done. The Queen delighted in the exchange so much, she insisted it be called the Royal Exchange, which it was. And of course this was founded on the bequest of Thomas Gresham. And there is another version of the grasshopper. Do you believe that one? Is that better than the one on his gun? I leave that for you to decide. It's also the period where Gresham College itself was founded, which gives free lectures, professors in the new thinking, the new science of astronomy, geometry, physics, etc. Now, these are very important for cartography, for planning, for navigation. So it's all very well to have people who can juggle money and do deals, but unless you can get the ships out there to these places and you understand the increasing geometry required, not just for navigation, but also for shipbuilding, all this is part and parcel of the new mercantile revolution. So the armed Elizabethan merchantmen are part of this great change. In this period from 1571 to 1580, a very short period, we see the merchants meeting in the Royal Exchange and forming the Muscovy Company, the Eastern Company, that's Russia and the Baltic, the French Company, the Spanish Company, the North African Company, and the Constantinople Company, the Levant Company, forming these dedicated trading exercises with their various means of exchange, currency exchange and cargoes, etc. Tied in directly with that is the exploration of new worlds, where we see the Golden Hind, a very similar size to the Gresham Ship, circumnavigating the globe. Took 3 years, but there you go, it's quite a big place. But Drake did do a bit of pillaging on the way. He had one or two little sidelines to deal with. But he got back in the end. It was possible, thanks to the geometry, the astronomy, and the increasing development of cartography, which was based on the back of trade. And trade and exploration lead directly to, of course, war. So these are the three aspects that underpin the need for armed Elizabethan merchantmen, because, of course, you need a ship that can trade. You can need a ship that can explore, that's robust enough to sail, to discover a Northwest Passage or whatever, and also belligerent enough to deal with any pirates you might find on the high seas. Or indeed, the Elizabethan merchantmen, the Queen's Navy only had about 30 ships in 1580. London provided 34 merchant ships, which were requisitioned and joined the fight against the Spanish Armada. And if it hadn't been for the squadrons of merchant vessels which joined the Queen's Navy, the Spanish Armada would have undoubtedly taken over. So some of the larger ships of the time were those used by the Levant Company, the company that sends ships to Constantinople and back via Venice and all sorts. Robust vessels, armed, because you never know when you're going to meet some Barbary pirates. Crews hardened for action and for long-distance sailing. And these are the guys, the merchant marine, that actually saw off the Spanish Armada. So they could do either. They could be merchantmen or they could be sailors. There was little distinction. And because they got so good at being both, whenever the Queen needed a fighting ship, they ended up doing both. Now, privateers, which is a polite word for pirates, were sponsored by the city, the Corporation of London, deliberately sponsored as a mercantile exercise, and its leading merchant class. And in this period after the Spanish Armada, 70 London vessels undertook city-sponsored pirate expeditions because the ships were robust, because they were armed, and they took, the ships alone were valued at £100,000, let alone the cargoes they also pinched, redistributed or whatever. So London actually has more pirates than Devon, Cornwall, Bristol and Bridgewater combined. So next time you go for whatever this talk like a pirate day thing, or if you want to talk like a pirate, you don't say "ar" and talk in a southwest accent. You talk in a good Cockney accent. You get it sorted, innit? So that's how pirates are supposed to talk, because most of them come from London. And all these highly respectable city merchants, including somebody called Queen Elizabeth I, sponsored them. So this is what these ships are all about. They can do anything. Now, to take an example, the Cherabin, which is sometimes called the Cherubim or the Cherubim. People can't spell. There may be 3 different ships, but I suspect they're actually the same one with some poor spelling. We know that it bought 2 new sakers, 2 new guns in 1590. Therefore, it was upping its stock. Note it only bought 2, not 12, as it were. And between 1590 and 1600, having got its new guns, it was definitely working for the Levant Company. We have the records of it going back and forwards. But there was a break of service in 1591, where it was a privateer working with Thomas Howard in the Azores, and it personally captured £2,000 worth of treasure and sugar, ginger, etc., during its privateering pirate campaign. So sometimes it would be a Levant Company trader, and sometimes it could equally well be a privateer, I beg its pardon. Now, the Cherubim, however you spell it, sunk in the Channel, in the estuary, in 1603, fully laden on an outward bound voyage from London. It sank in a storm in the Thames estuary of the Kentish Flats. Does that ring a bell? So here are the Kentish Flats. This is Margate, Kentish Flats, and that's where the Gresham Ship was discovered, which is bizarrely exactly the place, roughly speaking, where we might expect the remains of the Cherubim to lie, which was fully laden, because when Wellington found it, it had 2,700 ingots on it. So I think there's a very good chance that the Gresham Ship was actually the Cherubim. We also know that the Cherubim was drifting in a peculiar way because it lost its sails and its rudder. Its rudder was torn off. And quite interestingly, we didn't find a rudder there. And interestingly, it's very strangely orientated for a boat going up and down the Thames. It's sideways on, which looks like it's drifting helplessly. Anyway, that's just a thought. So I'll now move very quickly on to what's happening next. That's a summary of our research. The hull timbers themselves and the artefacts have got new homes, or will have new homes. The artefacts are going to Southend Museum, which will be finished in hopefully 2018. Here is the new Southend Museum, and if you look out from the windows there, across the estuary, you'll be able to see the very place where the Gresham Ship or the Cherubim went down. And for those of you who are interested in London archaeology, the Southend Museum will also, the new museum will also hold the Prittlewell Prince Saxon treasures from the elite burial from the king who was the king when London Wick was founded, but that's another story. As for the timbers themselves, the hull timbers, they're also having a little final voyage. Their final voyage took place last year, where the timbers were taken out of the lake in Horsey in Portsmouth, put on the back of a low loader, and taken up to Leicestershire. Why Leicestershire, I hear you say? That well-known port, that well-known... well, this is the Operation Gresham team, which includes various people from the Nautical Archaeology Society and various people from the Royal Engineers. Can you tell the difference? And we borrowed some of their low loaders, and the timbers were taken up and transported across country to Leicestershire in an amazing weekend operation. And there you see them being loaded around. Leicestershire has a large quarry, which has stopped quarrying, and here you see it drained with a lot of ledges in it. Look at all those steps, all those ledges, those terraces. Now, if you flood that quarry, you therefore have a wonderful diving opportunity for novice divers to dive on these shallow sites and more experienced divers to dive on the deeper levels, all perfectly safe with very good visibility and no currents. So it's an ideal dive centre. That's what it used to look like. This is the same area. Now it's been flooded. And in the National Dive Centre at Stoney Cove, they've popped in a few odds and ends, like the occasional submarine or the occasional aeroplane. so that the divers can swim around and actually see things as they dive around here. So it's an amazing place, really. Here you see the Stoney Cove National Dive Centre without the water, but you can see all the ledges, and all these red dots mark something they've put in there, the occasional wreck here, the occasional submarine, etc. Some on the higher shells and some on the lower shells. And this is now our very own display case for an underwater museum for the Gresham Ship. That little one there, it has its very own shelf, so we can keep an eye on it and etc. and monitor how it's doing. So we have our very own underwater museum where, provided you get suitably equipped, you can actually visit a 16th century ship in its own little open water display case. But even more important than that, because 30,000 people visit this site every year, so that's quite a good turnover to see a genuine Tudor shipwreck, Elizabethan shipwreck. But we also use it as an underwater classroom. The Nautical Archaeology Society, I should say, train the next generation of nautical archaeologists on this site. So it has two very different uses, a sort of public outreach use and an educational use, as the next generation and the next generation after that will be trained on underwater timber hull recording techniques on the Gresham Ship. So we hope we've put it to good use. So that's where I stop wittering. This is the list of all the people who've helped us on the project. So I would personally like to thank all of those, and I would like you to thank all the people who helped on the Gresham Ship project. Thank you.